Today on TimesCast, the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, along with 3 of his staff members, were killed Tuesday in what may have been a pre-planned attack on the American consulate in Benghazi.
Since our founding, the United States has been a nation that respects all faiths. We reject all efforts to denigrate the religious beliefs of others. But there is absolutely no justification to this type of senseless violence.
Deputy Foreign Editor Michael Slackman spoke with diplomatic correspondent Stephen Lee Myers about the early fallout.
Stephen, what's been the response so far in Washington?
Well, as you would expect, there's a great outpouring of grief and condolences. The president has already spoken from the Rose Garden. Secretary of State Clinton spoke in the treaty room at the State Department. President Obama is on his way over there now and is going to meet privately with the workforce there to express his condolences and to thank them for what is often, as we've seen, dangerous work that diplomats do around the world.
Stephen, this is said to be a response to a video that had gone out that many Muslims felt insulted the Prophet Muhammad. That wasn't a surprise. Libya post the revolution has also been very unstable. Is there thinking that perhaps there was a security lapse there and that more could have been done to protect this, to prevent this from happening?
Well, obviously, after an incident like this, there's going to be a thorough investigation by the diplomatic security team at the State Department to figure out what exactly went wrong. As I understand it, not having been to this particular building in Benghazi, that it wasn't a heavily fortified compound the way many of our embassies are in other places. Whether or not that made it more vulnerable to attack, it's hard to say. I think the real question is this obscure video that, frankly, no one here had ever heard of until these protests began. I think the question is what incited such a passionate, angry response. I mean, it's a very volatile time in the region generally, and in Libya in particular, there's competing forces now vying for power and influence in a transitional period.
All of that raises the question, I think, again, as to what kind of security measures were put in place, since, as you said, it is a volatile region at this time. The United States was very instrumental in helping bring about the fall of Colonel Gaddafi and the rise of this new democratic transition that they're attempting in Libya. Does that perhaps add to the sense of frustration and violation and victimization? And does it cause any kind of rethinking of the policy towards Libya?
Well, I think one of the things that, in fact, Ambassador Stevens talked about a lot was the reception that he received, even when the conflict was still underway. Remember, he was the representative to the Libyan rebels, even when Gaddafi was still in power. And he went into Benghazi a year ago, April, and talked about seeing the American, British, French flags flying in the square they renamed Freedom Plaza. The reception of many Libyans has been quite welcoming, and you know they appreciate the support that the United States and the other NATO nations gave to help overthrow Gaddafi. Secretary Clinton, in her statement today, said that this was an attack by a small group of savage thugs.
This is an attack that should shock the conscience of people of all faiths around the world. We condemn in the strongest terms this senseless act of violence, and we send our prayers to the families, friends, and colleagues of those we've lost.
Stephen, the ambassador was known to be somewhat optimistic about the future. He felt that forces of change had been unleashed and there was no going back. Isn't that right?
He was. I mean, in fact, generally most diplomats, most ambassadors are fairly optimistic about their countries, and for the most part. And you know, Libya has gone through a tremendous transition. It's a difficult one. It's a painful one. There's a lot of concern about security there. I heard today that in recent months there have been a string of attacks, assassinations in Benghazi, suggesting a kind of, if not lawlessness, at least a lot of turmoil underway as the country, you know, strives to hold elections and become a functioning democracy.
And with this tragedy occurring right in the middle of the political season here in the United States, it's injected foreign policy into the campaign in a way we haven't seen thus far. White House correspondent Peter Baker reports.
The attacks in Benghazi and protests in Cairo completely upended the presidential campaign here in the United States today. The question became who could be the best commander-in-chief. Governor Romney went on the attack early, suggesting that President Obama's administration had appeased Islamic extremists rather than standing firm against them, and tying that into the attack and effect that happened on the consulate in Benghazi. President Obama's campaign pushed back, said that Governor Romney was politicizing the international affair, and most other Republicans didn't join in with Governor Romney in this line of attack. Governor Romney's campaign on Tuesday night issued a statement that they wanted to put out at midnight. They embargoed it originally, and then they took the embargo off and said, okay, you can report it right away, criticizing the Obama administration for an initial statement put out by the embassy in Cairo. And the embassy's statement in Cairo, before all of the violence had happened, said, we in effect express sympathy for the Muslims who were offended by this YouTube video criticizing Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. Governor Romney, in effect, was trying to tie that statement in by the embassy overseas to his broader critique of President Obama for, in theory, apologizing for the country. After it was clear this morning that Ambassador Stevens and the other 3 American diplomats had been killed, Governor Romney made a hastily arranged statement to the reporters following him in Jacksonville, Florida. He expressed regret and sympathy and sorrow for the deaths of the American diplomats, and then doubled down on his criticism from the night before.
I also believe the administration was wrong to stand by a statement sympathizing with those who had breached our embassy in Egypt, instead of condemning their actions. It's never too early for the United States government to condemn attacks on Americans and to defend our values.
He's talking about, in effect, the notion of criticizing this anti-Islam video that incited so many Arabs to protest against the United States. Then, less than an hour later, President Obama made his own hastily scheduled appearance in the Rose Garden. He was accompanied by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He stayed in president mode rather than candidate mode, didn't mention Governor Romney, didn't address Governor Romney's criticism, instead expressed outrage over the attacks, sympathy for the families of those who were killed. But implicitly, he did, to some extent, rebut the governor's attack by saying he rejects denigrating other people's religions, but that was in no way any kind of justification for the sort of violence that we saw in Benghazi. This is a rare instance where a foreign policy crisis actually tests not just the incumbent but also the challenger. Obviously, it confronts President Obama with a foreign policy crisis. How he responds to this attack, the deaths of the American diplomats will be measured by voters on the campaign trail in the weeks to come, but also Governor Romney's response, his quick insertion of an attack into the conversation, even as the events were still unfolding, has been very widely criticized, particularly by Democrats, also by some pundits and even some Republicans today, and that will be seen as one measure, at least, of how he responds in a foreign policy crisis type situation.